Hello and welcome back to another build video. This time we are going to build the Yokosuka, also known Kugisho D4Y2-S Bomber Interceptor in 1/48 scale from FineMolds. Now this plane has really intrigued me with its inline engine, which wasn't the norm for Japanese planes during World War II, and the position of its 20mm cannon in the back sticking out through the canopy, which is very reminiscent what the Germans have done with their so-called Schräge Musik. In reality, this thing wasn't able to inflict much damage to the American bombers due to the fact that it was a dive bomber by design and was slow with not too great climb rate to reach the high altitude bombers. It had a few little successes here and there, but nonetheless, it couldn't do much, let alone turn the tides of war. This version of the D4Y2 is really a testament to the saying, desperate times need desperate measures. The kit itself is based on molds made in 1993, so don't expect top quality here. I'll be honest, I was a bit let down in terms of that, as I was expecting better from a Japanese manufacturer, perhaps because Tamiya have spoiled us over the years. But overall, it was a pleasant build with relatively minor problems. This video is going to focus on building the whole plane plus the cockpit painting and weathering. Now let's get into it. And as usual, I will direct my attention towards the wing, especially the underside, because this has retractable landing gears. So what I want to do at the very beginning to see how much pain is going to be to put that whole thing together if closed landing gear is not supported by default. And of course here it's not, but luckily it's not that bad and it can be easily closed shut with some gaps here and there that need to be filled, like that tiny square one you could see on the side of this big panel, like right there where I'm gluing. Also, there's going to be a nice big gap between that back panel, the last small panel, and the rest of the parts, because again, it looks like that making things according to size is quite hard. I'm not going to diss on them because I can understand not everything goes the way it should go, or like sometimes they change the sizes, or like the size is not 100% correct, because it makes much easier to make a mold where things fit together and they are not really thinking about someone like a crazy person like myself to build this landing gear closed. Understand. I fully understand, and that at least is a challenge in some shape or form, but otherwise it would be nice if things would fit together much better than this. Now that I have the landing gear closed on both sides, now we glue together the wings, the two wing halves. And I should say that there aren't too many guiding pins and locators and whatnot in this kit, so sometimes you have to be careful that things don't slide apart. And for that I like to use my handy dandy clips, like that, holding things together. After everything has cured, let's focus on filling the gaps with my good old trusty friend, the sprue glue. Now the reason why I'm using sprue glue here instead of some kind of putty like Mr. Dissolve putty or the Vallejo water-based putty is because these gaps are really big, so I want to fill them nice and proper so I can send things back a bit and then potentially rescribe some of these panel lines. After finishing the wings, I direct my attention was the props, and I should mention here that there is no help whatsoever to position the props, the blades themselves, correctly. This means that you just have to eyeball it and make sure that each blade is in the correct angle, so the whole thing not going to look weird and crooked and whatnot. Now with my trusty saw blade, I deepen the panel line around the cone. This is actually going to be a reoccurring theme with this build, because I felt like the panel lines most of the times are quite shallow, so they needed a bit of deepening with either with this little saw blade that I have or some scribing tool. And after finished scribing, I use Tamiya Extra Thin to soften the edges of the groove, and of course if there were any leftover tiny plastic particulates, it will melt it back into the main surface. And with that, the prop is done. I'm not going to share with you the painting and chipping that I did on the prop. There is a separate video link in the top right corner for that. Now here I'm going against the instructions and I'm gluing together the intake parts like that, and the main reason is that it, as you can see, doesn't have any good locator pins or anything. And this made me worried about potential misalignments in the build, but let's be honest, it's not that visible anyway. The opening for the intake is quite narrow, but still, if someone would look in there when you are not looking, then they might think that it's a bit misaligned now, isn't it? I also removed these internal locator parts, which are for the intake to sit against, because I felt like they are in the way for me to push the intake all the way and not having a gap on the outside. And here as well, I'm going against the instructions, because during dry fitting I noticed if I would have the two cowling halves glued together and later glued to the fuselage, then I would have this weird little step in the surface of the plane, which I think is much harder to get rid of rather than having a gap along the cowling on the top and the bottom, which needs to be filled, and then a small part rescribed. And of course you can see how I was struggling a bit to align the two parts together, because again there are no pins or locators or anything that would help you in aligning these two. But in the end I succeeded, and this is how they look. I also used some sprue glue to strengthen the bond between the fuselage halves and the cowling, and I also dremeled and cleaned up the inside like that. Welcome to the jungle, sorry, I mean the cockpit, which is, how should I say, it does really give the vibe of an old kit, which means that it's not too great, it's not too bad either. You can have some ejector pin marks like the ones you see there, but luckily they are going to be all covered up, and I didn't really bother to fix those because of that. In terms of detail, again, it has quite a good amount, but not that much that would make anyone excited who loves to do a lot of cockpits. For me, I think it's enough, but I can understand if someone would look at it and it's like, nah, this needs some extra. And yeah, it definitely does need some extra, but I'm not here to make a fully detailed kit with the kitchen sink thrown at it. I just here to have a bit of fun and have this plane in my collection. One good advice here is that always check the hole before you put your pin in, so to speak. Here I willingly went and thought that the rudder pedals will just fit in their respective hole without any problem, and sadly it didn't, but using a bit of force, as my Japanase said, should solve everything, and if it doesn't, then you have to use more force and everything will be okay eventually. Wise words from my old master, wise words. Now using some sprue glue, I fill in that gaping ejector pin mark right in the middle of the instrument panel. And here you can see me gluing in that window that divides the gunner and the pilot part of the cockpit. And as you can see, there is going to be a bit of a gap which I don't really like, and it's actually in a position that I think can be visible. So what I did here, I used a tiny amount of sprue glue to fill those gaps in. Be very, very gentle because you don't really want to get the sprue glue anywhere else, as it will fog up and stain that clear plastic. And with the help of some super glue, I am going to glue in place the magazine for the 20mm cannon. And to help the paint to stick to the surface, we are going to use some Mr. Hobby metal primer. This is really good stuff, but there is one thing you have to keep in mind though. That is that you want to apply it to a metal surface that is rough in texture. So don't try to apply it on a smooth, shiny finish because it will peel off like a thin layer of film. Make sure that you sand the surface and that the metal is going to be rough to the touch. Well, you don't have to make it very coarse, but you know, just with a, I don't know, like an 800 or 600 grit sandpaper you use on it and it should be fine. Now we are putting in the radio equipment, by the way. And as you can see here, eyeballing is the name of the game. Just make sure that everything sits perfectly in center, because on top of the radio there is going to be that extra part with that dividing window screen kind of thing, and that needs to be perfectly in center if you want to make sure that you can't put on the canopy without any problems, and I do want that actually. Now I'm going to super glue in this metal piece, which is the one that is going to have the cannon rest upon, and I am going to glue it on the left side of the cockpit onto the wall perpendicular to it, and going to paint it up all together with it. Now this piece is interesting because this is more for bombing targets on the ground and not shooting down big American bombers from the air. So I don't know why this version of the plane has it. I understand that it is probably a manufacturer decision to use a kit for multiple versions, and this probably shouldn't be here in this one because the bomber really doesn't do any bombing. In this case, they should manage the gun to shoot down the big American bombers overhead. And here we jumped a bit in progress, and as usual I primed it with Mishimoto's gray primer and then gave it a good coat of Mitsubishi interior green, as you can see here. And now I'm using a fine paintbrush to paint in the frame of the dividing window. I was thinking about masking at first, but then I just decided against it because I felt like this is the easiest option, and in the end, if you make an oopsie, you can get rid of that with a toothpick, a wooden toothpick, and just scrape it off. Now, using a very dark grey from AK 3rd generation water-based acrylics, I am painting in the magazine for the Canon. Over time, I have found that it's much better to use a very dark grey most of the time than using pure black. I know, it sounds unreasonable, but trust me, sometimes, maybe a lot of times, it's much better to use grey than a pure black. Like here, on this tiny part of the cockpit. Or here, on these instruments on the cockpit wall. Or on this another set of instruments on the cockpit wall. Did I mention that a cockpit usually has another wall? And those have instruments as well. And let's not forget about the radio equipment. That is usually black, isn't it? Now it is dark grey. And the instructions said that this targeting sight should be black. You know what that means? Dark grey. And this is how it looks. Everything nice, dark and grey. Or is it everything? No, there is a bit more. Like that. Look at that, all the dark grey. Looks pretty neat. Now let's use some light brown on the cushions of the seats. Well, first let's do the gunner seat. Actually, looking at this seat does make me question if the gunner/bomber has a parachute or not, because usually you have the kind of seat where it's a tub and then the parachute is what the personnel is sitting on, like the pilot, like what you see with German planes most of the time. Or it has an extra space behind the back of the pilot or the personnel, which will hold the parachute, like with this seat for the pilot. Now using some silver to color in the rudder pedals. And then using a mixture of silver and gold to color the tops of the oxygen tanks. And yes, oxygen tanks are black. I know what you think now. I'm just a rebel without a cause. After the cushions have dried, I went over with a soft tone wash paint from Army Painter. I tried to make it pool in certain areas, like that, and now we just wait until it dries. And whilst that's happening, we are going to paint the instrument panel. The bottom part, which I'm painting right now, is Mitsubishi Cockpit green. And the top part, for some good measure, we are going to use dark grey. For the back of the guns, I decided to use some gunmetal. Also, let's put in the targeting sight and paint it dark grey as well. Well, not all of it, just the bottom. After I decided that I'm done painting, I've coated everything with VMS satin varnish. I did mask off the separating window and I did apply the varnish with a paintbrush after I finished decaling and the second coat of varnish. Now I'm not going to bore you with the decaling process because it is the usual as it goes with microset and microsol. What I'm going to say is though that the decals are quite good. There are quite a few these little instruments that you have to put on, which is a welcome addition for the detailing. And yeah, there is really nothing else to say about these decals. These are good, good decent decals, not too thick, not too thin, and they go well on top of the surface and really respond well to microset and microsole. So after all the decaling and painting, this is how it looks like. Again, it's not the greatest, not the best, but it's good enough. And now let's try something different. AK panel liner, dark brown. Well, actually, it was a joke because I didn't use it in the end, as at the very beginning I realized that it's not really good. It's not dark enough to do the panel lines. So I just went ahead and used my usual suspects, which are like all paints of black and dark brown mixture, like a 50-50, and then using odorless thinner to really thin it down and just run it around within the cockpit, doing all the details. So just to be clear, I'm not diminishing the use of AK panel liners, and especially that dark brown one, but in this case it really didn't work well with this cockpit green. It's just not dark enough. I think if you would use it with a more sandy yellowish kind of color, base color, then it's okay, but yeah, it didn't work with this green at all. And now we just run around with the wash on the cockpit floor and get some details out of it. Well, trying to at least. And after we waited long enough for the oil to dry, well, not dry completely, but how should I say, so it doesn't have that shine to it anymore from the thinner, then it's good to go. Take a clean brush and some thinner again and just clean up the unwanted excess of paint, or just move it around as you see fit, like for example moving it closer to the recessed areas, to the small detail. As you can see here, I'm trying to convince the paint to move a bit on to the right side. Well then, let's concentrate on the assembly. Fitting in the cockpit itself wasn't that bad. It really has its own little place in which it goes in quite snug, and there are a couple of points which make our lives easier when it comes to gluing it into position. Regardless if you put it in left or right first, it is going to be very simple. Now the other part which did give me a bit of a headache, but luckily super glue is always at hand, is the instrument panel for the pilot, because the instruction sheet is a bit weird to say the least when it tried to show me where it goes, and there is not much of an exact position for it on the cockpit or on the walls either. So I tried to position it somehow to be it in the middle, and yeah, in the end it worked out, because our best friend super glue is always there for us to help in these dire situations. And now let's close the fuselage up, which by the way is very simple and it goes together quite well. You can see here that a good chunk of the bottom part of the fuselage is missing, or at least I should say it's a separate piece, probably because different versions of this plane have different kind of pieces underneath. One would think of the arresting hook, because initially this plane was made to take off and land from carriers. Now you see me here gluing the cowling together, but I have to separate it a bit later on, because if you do this, then you're not going to put in properly the intake beneath, and that's going to cause a problem. So what I did, as you can see here, so I did use an X-Acto knife blade and just wedged it in, separated the piece, because I wanted to make sure that how this intake is glued in, then there is no difference in the what's the correct terminology that I would use, that there is no step where the two things meet, like the side of the intake and the cowling. But you can see that now we are going to have to deal with a really nasty gap on top and the bottom, but more on that later. And this is the bottom piece of the fuselage, which I was talking about. Now, one thing that I want to mention here is that it had two walls on both ends, which I did cut out so I could bend it a bit more with hand, because the fit wasn't too great. There would have been like this step between the wall of this bottom part and the fuselage itself. And I would rather do these things in a way where I can avoid sanding. I do think that sanding can damage things so much that it would be really hard to recover any detail and such. So where I can, I do avoid it. And now, reaching for my trusty sprue glue, I'm going to fill that nasty gap underneath of the cowling. And the reason why I'm using sprue glue instead of any other fillers, like for example Vallejo's water-based putty or Mr. Hobby putties or something like that, is because I want to have a strong solidified plastic bond in between, which can be easily rescribed. And sometimes I think putties are a bit more brittle when they harden as regular plastic, and I think because of that the sprue glue is a much better solution in this case. And we're also going to use the sprue glue on that nasty gap right there, where that extra bottom piece meets the fuselage on the side. And I'm not going to rescribe that, I just want that to be gone completely, forever, out of my life, just gone. Now we have arrived at the most fun part of this kit, and by fun I mean suffering. And don't worry, I'm not going to share all the fun with you, because here I decided that I want to rescribe all the panel lines because I found them to be a bit shallow. And when one wants to put down a primer, then a metallic color, and then another color on top, and then varnish, and then this and that, and then varnish again, perhaps, then you will have a lot of layers, and there is the potentiality of losing some of the panel lines if they get clogged up with paint. And I wanted to avoid that, so what I did, as you can see here, used my trusty saw blade and my trusty panel line scribing tool and redid all the panel lines, which was a fantastically boring and annoying work, but it was good to practice how to stay in line. Now, I'm not going to say that I am the panel lining god, because man, some other people can do crazy stuff with these scribing tools. But I'm hoping that I've gotten a bit better just alone by doing this kit. And you know what they say, practice makes perfect, or just more annoyed, like in this instance. And after I have done all the wing work, I diverted my attention to the fuselage because, well, I was already through the looking glass, so why not continue? Now I was thinking about doing the rivet detail as well, but I thought to myself that doing all the panel line work is stressful enough, and probably if I would have done the rivets as well, I would have gotten really close to a heart attack, because being so stressed out not to mess up anything. So I just left it there and just moved on with my life, as I would advise to anyone when they are in doubt whether they want to do something or not. And of course, just to talk about the build a bit more, as this guy is trying his best to do nice panel lines, you can see the end result of filling that big gap on the cowling's bottom and now rescribing it. And what I do here, that I use this nifty little saw blade to do the initial work, because it's nice, straight, and you can easily follow a very shallow panel line with it as well. And after that's done, I take the scriber and I just get all the gunk out of it and deepen it a bit more. And when that's done, then you can use some thin Tamiya cement or something else that is very thin, of course, and just dip it a bit over there on the panel line, so the the capillary action does its work and lets the cement flow into all these lines and grooves and just melt the tiny leftover plastic particulates back into the main body. Just like you can see it here, but I presume that this is common knowledge nowadays for all my viewers, but it's always good to remind ourselves how things are done. And now I should correct myself, because I did state before that I didn't do any kind of rivet detail work, and that's not completely true. This panel here in the middle section of the bottom of the fuselage, it did have a bit of a rivet detail for, I think those weren't really rivets but rather screws, and they were very shallow. So what I tried to do is that I used my trusty little drill and just drilled in tiny little holes to make them deeper and possibly nicer. And to be honest, in hindsight, it wouldn't really matter too much because it's on the bottom, and second of all, it didn't turn out too well. They are a bit misaligned, but it's always good to practice and get annoyed by it. And then we have arrived at the full assembly part, where you put on the wings onto the fuselage, and as you can see, the fit is okay-ish, but you're going to have to deal with some gaps at the wing roots, which is quite common, to be honest, with a lot of kits, so it shouldn't be a big surprise to anyone. After the wings, we do the horizontal stabilizers, and their fit was okay, much better than the wings, so I won't complain about it. Now let's do the vertical stabilizer with the rudder, and the kit comes with two options, so I chose one. Surprise. But one thing I need to mention here, that I did cut off that locator pin that it had on its bottom, because when I tried to use it with that, the fit wasn't great. The stabilizer wasn't really perfectly centered, it was misaligned, and I thought that just cutting it off and just gluing it like that is much better. And it's going to have a bit of a gap though that needs to be filling afterwards. Also, willy-nilly, I did close in the rear landing gear at the very beginning, which wasn't correct, because I forgot to consult any resources or information about this plane, which would have told me right away that this type, the D4Y2, doesn't have a retractable rear landing gear. I think that's the next generation of it which has it, which is I think the D4Y3. but not the Y2, so you have to keep in mind. But now let's do some good old-fashioned gap filling with putty, and for this I use Vallejo's water-based putty and a toothpick, which at first seemed to be a good idea because I completely forgot that I have a much better tool in my collection to do things like this. And that is, my friends, this silicone-tipped sculpting brush tool thingy, which you can get it from Amazon or eBay. It's dirt cheap, but it's really good to massage putty into the right gaps, places, whatnot, and then getting rid of the excess. We also need to take care of the gaps between the fuselage body and landing gear doors, because those are massive. And after we left the putty dry for 10 or 20 minutes, then you can come in with a cotton bud dipped in water and just rub it up, dub away the excess and all your problems with it. And after all this filling experience, get it? Filling? Okay, sorry, I will show myself out. But before I go, I'm just going to say that now I'm going to drill out the gun openings on the top of the cowling, and then I just glue it in place. And you may also notice that I removed the pin for the propellers, because now that we have this gap, that pin was actually only attached to the right side of the cowling, and now that would have been off center. This means that I'm just only going to glue the propeller in place and it's not going to be movable. Now this one I found a bit interesting because probably this is the first time I come across things like this. And this is this tiny U-shaped part, which is the front of this top intake that you see here, and you just put it there and it looks like that it has a hole in it. Now I did have to double, triple, quadruple check which end is the front and which end is the back, because it looks symmetrical but it felt like it's really not. So I did had a bit of a faff with it to position it correctly, as you can see here, but when it's done and it looks decent. Again, sorry about the faffing, but it's just that it doesn't have any help with any locators or pins or anything. You literally have to eyeball this in. Now I'm going to glue in the magnet for the stand, and checking the plane's center of mass, it was roughly at the end of the bomb bay doors. So that's where the magnet goes. One thing to note here, if you would want to put it on a stand, I might advise against the magnetic type, because the bottom of the fuselage is really not as flat as a lot of other planes. It has a nice curvy belly, so to speak, and that doesn't really sit well with the magnet, as you see here. In the end, it is going to hold it up in place, but a pin would be a much better solution in this case. And now you can see brain fart in action. Yeah, that would be the correct terminology to use for this stupid thing that I'm doing here, that I'm using a darkish green to color in the part of where the bomb targeting site is located. I don't know why I'm using this color. I'm doing it. To be fair, it's not going to be that visible. The window of it is quite small and it's on the bottom, but still, it was a stupid idea, which I did regret afterwards, but after everything is closed, you can't really do much about it. And again, I don't think that this targeting site is actually installed in this version of the plane, because it would be just an extra weight. And when you have a big cannon in the end of the cockpit, then you really want to get rid of as much weight as possible. especially when your sole purpose at that point of the war is to climb as high as possible, as fast as possible, to introduce yourself with that cannon of yours to the American bombers. Now let's close up the bomb bay, which is going to have a couple of gaps which are going to be filled later on. But like, this is the other thing, that yeah, it's not going to take a bomb with it, for example, when it climbs up to high altitudes, because why would it? It's just extra weight. I think FineMolds should have done a bit more research whether this plane has that targeting system in there or not, because I have the sneaking suspicion that it doesn't. And here we have arrived at the final stretch, where I'm actually using a bit of dark gray to color in the part of the fuselage that is going to be visible underneath the canopy. Well, the front canopy part. I am also coloring in this tiny bump in the canopy on the inside, which is very suspiciously looking like the cannon's targeting. And speaking of the cannon, after giving it a nice coat of black primer, now I am doing some dry brushing with the gunmetal. And here is the end result. I think it looks quite nice. I was pleasantly surprised how well the detail was on these metal parts. Now the thing is that the canopy wasn't really sitting well in its position, and there were quite a few gaps, which again I filled in with Vallejo's water-based putty and the use of my trusty silicone brush. And finally we have arrived to my least favorite part when it comes to building an aircraft, especially when it's an aircraft with so many windows. And I thought the Stuka was hard. But as you can see, I do my usual thing where I take thin strips of Tamiya masking tape, cut them up and then put it on as a little frame around the edges of each window. So what I'm doing is that first I position this small strip right close to the edge. So one end is at the very edge of the frame, like so. Push it down so it sticks properly. And then I take my trusty X-Acto knife and I cut off the excess as close as possible to the edge of the frame. Like so. It is advised to use a fresh blade and not a dull one, as you saw me there finicking with the cut. And if you are lucky, the excess is going to be the same size as the other side of the frame. Perfect! What a coincidence. And this is how it should look, all ready to be filled in with masking liquid. And for this maneuver as well, I highly recommend these silicone sculpting brushes, because they are really good to massage the masking liquid right to the edge of these masking tape frames. And afterwards the cleaning is a breeze. It doesn't matter if the masking liquid is still liquid and sticky or it's completely dry and cured, you can just get it off from the tip. Really simple, without any extra tools. And now the last touch, putting on the antenna, which I forgot. But then again, it was okay that I forgot, because it would have been in the way of masking anyway. And the Canon already gave me a bit of a headache when it came to masking and, you know, trying to mask the whole cannon barrel up and that big hole which it came out from. But let's stop here because this is the end of the video. And with that, my friends, I have finished the build. Of course, there is some priming, painting, more painting, and some more painting, and then some varnishing, weathering, and a bit more painting here and there, and it should be done, like you see here. And I presume you would be more interested in that, but I have to say that sorry, it is going to be in the next one. So stay tuned until then, and see you on the next one. Bye bye.